Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kelsey Shevlin. I'm a sophomore majoring in statistics and double minoring in accounting and Italian. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and involved in NC State Scholars Program as a University Scholars Assistant and member of Scholars Council. I'm here today on behalf of the University Scholars Program and WISE, the Women in Science and Engineering Program. It is my honor to introduce our speaker, NASA astronaut Christina Hammock Koch. Astronaut Koch grew up in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and knew from an early age that she wanted to work with NASA. The pieces started to fit together quickly for her. After graduating from the North Carolina School of Science and Math, she came here to NC State University to pursue degrees in both physics and electrical engineering. She also participated in and completed the University Scholars Program. Astronaut Koch was named, in perhaps an early harbinger of things to come, an astronaut scholar in 2000 by the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation and graduated from the NASA Academy program at Goddard Space Flight Center in 2001. Upon completing her master's degree in electrical engineering, she worked as an electrical engineer in the Laboratory for High Energy Astrophysics at Goddard from 2002 to 2004, where she contributed to scientific instruments on several NASA missions studying cosmology and astrophysics. From there, she moved on to the Antarctic, completing a winter over season at the Edmondson Scott South Pole Station and a season at Palmer Station. While serving as a research associate in the U.S. Antarctic program, she was also a member of the firefighting teams and the Ocean Glacier Search and Rescue teams. In other words, she's both brilliant and badass. Following her Antarctic work, Astronaut Koch returned to space science instrument development for 2 years, then returned to remote scientific fieldwork both in Antarctica and Greenland. From there, she went to work with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration as a field engineer in Barrow, Alaska, and then as station chief of the American Samoa Observatory. In 2013, she was selected as one of 8 members of the 21st NASA Astronaut Class and completed training in July of 2015. Today, she returns to North Carolina State and the University Scholars Program to share her experiences and spread her inspiration. Please join me in welcoming astronaut Christina Hammock Koch to the stage.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. Also, thanks for leaving your notes up here because I'm actually basically going to go through that life story again, but with pictures. So, I wanted to say thank you so much for having me back. It is awesome to be back at NC State, and thanks to the Scholars Forum for inviting me back. I myself was sitting in these Scholars Forums, and I know that some of them are awesome and some of them can be bust. So I hope that I give you one that's really good, and I hope we have a lot of interaction at the end. We're going to do questions at the end. So I appreciate that cell phones are off right now, but if someone asks me a question that I don't know, I'm going to need someone to turn it on so we can Google it real quick. Figure that one out. That was supposed to be funny, so you guys can laugh anytime. So to start my talk today, I wanted to say that I am going to talk a little bit about my path because that's what I was asked to do. I was sitting in this exact theater at Scholars Forums many years ago, and I have been fortunate enough to fulfill my dream, which is to become a NASA astronaut. So we're going to talk about my path, but I'd also like to work in a couple themes, because you all are at the point in your life where you're going to be noticing there's a lot of big decisions coming down the road for you. And at every one of those decisions, the path that you choose has the ability to determine a huge part of your future. And so I always used to think, what do I use as a guiding principle when I have these giant decisions before me, whether to take a job at one place or another, whether to do a PhD or not, whether to study abroad or not, whether to focus on your hobbies more or your school, what to major in. These are all huge things that you're going to be faced with in the next coming years. So the first theme, and I think the most important theme, is to follow your passions. I also like to say, live the life you imagined. When you do what you're passionate about, not only are you guaranteed to be happy and fulfilled, but you're guaranteed to be contributing to society in the best way possible. So it's really a win-win. So I think you'll see that theme throughout this talk. It's also the theme of the quote that I have on the screen right now. And there's going to be a couple other themes that I hope to come out through the talk. So without further ado, When I was a little girl, I loved anything that made me feel small. And that included the night sky. It also included the ocean and other things that made me contemplate my place in the world and the vastness of the universe. I used to have posters up on my wall when I was a kid, not only of like the boy bands that were cool at the time, but of Antarctica, maps I had cut out from travel magazines, posters of space, posters of the shuttle. And so I had always been captivated by the concept of the universe and things that made me feel small. And how that manifested was I loved sailing. My favorite place on earth was Cape Lookout, North Carolina. I did go to the North Carolina School of Science and Math, and I also went to NC State. So when I was here, I chose NC State because it was an awesome school. It could offer me great programs in the two things I loved the most, which were the things about the universe that made me feel small, like big theories about the universe that in theoretical physics, as well as building things and engineering things and electrical engineering. So I double majored, physics and electrical engineering, and I actually went on to get a master's in electrical engineering during my time here as well. So this is the story about how that girl became that girl several years later, and how my start here informed that. So when I was at NC State, not only did I bust my butt working on those majors, but I also took rock climbing classes, I traveled, I was in the sailing club, I studied abroad in Ghana in West Africa, which really opened my horizons and taught me to be adaptable and taught me more about the world, taught me that I love traveling as well. And in fact, I traveled most of my summers. I would save up all my money from tutoring, and I would just go on crazy trips, driving across the country, going to Europe, things like that. But one summer, towards the end of my time, thankfully, I finally landed something serious, internship at NASA. And it was at the Laboratory for High Energy Astrophysics, which I was very excited to be at. And that job ended up turning into a full-time job. So I actually went straight to Goddard Space Flight Center and got my coveted job at NASA straight out of my time here at NC State. But I wasn't a workaholic, and I still had my hobbies. So I actually found competitive sailboat racing and joined a team doing that. And I was able to get a lot of leadership experience, teamwork experience, and basically just love my time outside of work as well as my time inside of work. I continued on in my job there, but I had kind of a nagging thing going on in the back of my mind, which was that I hadn't really lived up to these childhood dreams that I had had, those things that were embodied in the posters on my wall, and I was still looking for a way to go to Antarctica somehow, some way. So I'm cruising job sites, and I see that there's an opening for a cryogenics technician at the South Pole for a year. And I think, perfect. I actually didn't know much about cryogenics at the time. I was working as an electrical engineer, but I asked my friends at my lab to show me a little bit about it, and this is a picture of me transferring liquid helium, which is a cold liquid that's only 4 degrees above absolute zero. And I went into the job interview, told them what an expert I was at cryogenics, and a couple of months later, I ended up at the South Pole. So this is the South Pole of the planet, and at the South Pole you have 6 months of continuous 24 hours of light and 6 months of darkness, and one sunset that lasts about a month and one sunrise that lasts about a month in between the two. So my job as a cryogenics technician was to deliver this supercooled liquid to the telescopes at the South Pole, because the telescopes were looking out at very, very faint signals, and they had to be supercooled in order to be able to even read these signals. So during the summer months, it was light all of the time, and we worked very hard to get as much done as we could while we still had supplies coming in, because when it gets really cold in the winter at the South Pole, it's actually too cold for planes to land. So for 8 months, you and 80 people you did not pick get to spend a long winter together in the dark, and there are no fresh fruits coming in, no mail, no nothing. It's just you and your closest 80 friends. So as dusk set in, it started to feel very otherworldly, but I did love it because the South Pole is a place where in all directions, 360 degrees, no matter where you looked, it was flat and it was white. and the snow was 2 miles deep, and I had never even shoveled snow before I got there. So at this point, I'm going to show a little video. All right, I am finally done at MAPO, which is the telescope building, and I was there for over 2 hours fixing this computer, but luckily it's over and I'm walking back. There in the distance is the station, my home. So about this time, it was getting a little cooler, maybe about -60, something like that. But if I thought that was otherworldly, it got better. And this is a typical day in the winter at South Pole. So this picture was probably about -80 degrees, because I know that it wasn't any colder than that because I'm there with my snowmobile doing a cryogenics delivery, and I tried not to go out when it was below -80. It did, however, get to -105 that I went outside in, but that was kind of my limit. I saw 111 once on the thermometers and I thought, nah. But a lot of people ask me, so you didn't see the sun for 6 months. Did that bum you out? Were you depressed? And I think if you can see this picture, you know the answer is definitely not, because the stars and the southern lights, the auroras, are out almost all the time, and it is the most phenomenal sight you can imagine. So for someone who has loved space since being a small girl and loves things that makes you feel small, I was right in my element, and I absolutely loved my time at the South Pole. But I did move on from there to a station called Palmer Station, which was on the Antarctic Peninsula, and it was very different. We had lots of wildlife around. My job there was to run a physics lab, and I loved the job, but it was also kind of cool because I got to take some of my rock climbing experience and put it to use on the Glacier Search and Rescue Team. So in Antarctica, there's no 911 to call. You are your own fire team, your own ambulance, your own, in this case, Glacier Search and Rescue Team. So I got to see some incredible places, and I absolutely loved my time in Antarctica. But interestingly, again, there was something nagging me, which was that in my time working at NASA, I had never actually done the one thing that at that time was my biggest dream next to becoming an astronaut, which was to see something that I created launch into space. So I went back and I got a job back in space science instrument engineering, and I was actually at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab working for NASA missions making space gadgets. And this time I was able to get in kind of at the beginning from the ground up on a mission, an instrument design. And I stuck with it. It was interesting because right around this time I had heard that NASA was taking applications for being an astronaut. And I took a long, hard look at my experience to date, and even though I had wanted to be an astronaut forever, I decided I wasn't quite ready at this point. I couldn't necessarily sit across from someone at a table in an interview and be absolutely sure that I was the best person they could pick to be an astronaut. I wasn't sure I could contribute as much as I felt I should need to take on something so important as being in charge of the most expensive piece of equipment ever produced by the entire world, as well as being responsible for carrying the hopes and dreams of an entire world into space should I ever be lucky enough to go. So I didn't apply. I kept with what I was doing. And luckily enough, I did get to see my dream come true. I saw an instrument that I worked on. I worked on the detectors for a radiation instrument, and I got to watch it launch into space. And that instrument is still on its way to Jupiter today, and it's supposed to be getting there this year, so I can't wait. But this was, at this time, the closest I thought I was going to get to space. Now, why was this the closest I thought I was going to get? If I wanted to be an astronaut, why wasn't I sure that was going to happen? And the reason is that I went to space camp one year, and they had this talk about how you can become an astronaut. And they actually put a checklist up on the board or on the screen. And I thought, that's kind of lame. I don't want to become an astronaut because I did some checklist. I want to become an astronaut because I follow my own passions and they lead me to be someone who would be an awesome astronaut. So I had actually decided that I was going to take the path that I wanted to take, no matter how unconventional it was, and do those self-evaluations to decide whether it would ever be time for me to be an astronaut. So, I continued in my job as an electrical engineer, but I also pursued greater depths of my hobby that I love so much, which was rock climbing. So this brings me to my next theme, which is do the things that scare you. When you wonder at a crossroads what you should do, don't fall into the trap of doing the thing that intimidates you less. Usually, if you're intimidated by something, it's because it's right on the cusp of what you're totally capable of doing, but only if you trust yourself and have the confidence to do it. And that is exactly why I tell people do what scares you. So I was scared to death of learning this new type of rock climbing called traditional lead climbing, where it enables you to climb something as high as you find it, 200 meters, no problem, and you actually don't have a rope above your head. You actually carry up all the gear that you need, and the rope is behind you, and you have to rely on nothing but your own skill, experience, and abilities to get you out of any hairy situation that you find yourself in, which inevitably happens. So this experience was so important for my confidence and for learning how to operate when I was scared. And I think that I'll talk about why this was so important later, but I want to make sure to encourage everyone to not shy away from the things that scare you. So having done that, having kind of maxed out the hobbies that I loved and saw a dream of mine come true with a rocket launch, I went back to my other love, which was working in remote places. And I found myself working in Greenland on the summit of the ice cap. This station was a little different than South Pole. Here, there were only 5 people. So you were stuck for 3 months straight with the same 5 people. You ate every meal together, you did all your work together, you watched the movies together on the weekends, you exercised together, and that was all that you had. But it was a great experience in being adaptable, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I also had my wide open spaces, but coupled with that, I had amazing professional opportunities. The science was a step up, and I was able to really learn how to repair things without the comforts that you might have in a lab at home, having the ingenuity to fix things without a Radio Shack nearby or without a McMaster-Carr catalog to run to. So I loved this job. And I also kept up with my love of the night sky and the auroras. So this is a little video I'd like to share with you that I did. I got into time-lapse photography, and this is what the night sky looked like from my station on the ice cap of Greenland. So from Greenland, I moved on to Barrow, Alaska, which is the northern coast of Alaska. And there I had something new in my jobs in remote places. I had my own car. Because this time I was actually working in a small village where there were other people and other things like that. So it was kind of a new experience and an exciting one. And here is where I got another piece of information. I found out that NASA had another opening for astronauts. Took a long, hard look again. And I thought, well, I could go back and get a PhD. I could apply to be an astronaut. I could go back and be an electrical engineer. I could stay doing remote field work. And this brings me to another theme, which is make your decisions to keep as many doors open as possible. At this point in my life, the things that I was loving doing and the things that I still felt that I was gaining very valuable experience from actually wouldn't have been helped by getting a PhD. That was obviously something that was on the horizon for me my whole life because I loved research. But I decided that I would actually be overqualified for the work that I loved at that point, and I wouldn't have had the broad experience that I wanted to continue to hone if I picked something to study in too much detail. So while depending on your dreams, a PhD might be exactly the ticket that opens doors, for me it wasn't. And so a little bit of an unconventional path I took. I decided not to go past a master's degree at this point yet. But was I ready to be an astronaut? I took a long, hard look, and I decided that I was. I decided that the cumulative experience that I had gained working in remote places, running science experiments for researchers that weren't around, as well as the experience at NASA as an engineer, had actually prepared me to make the argument that I was worthy of the profession that I held in the highest regard. And so, one day, from my little living room, which was 500 miles north of the Arctic Circle, I hit submit on my application. And I went ahead and just kind of put it out of mind. I had heard that like 6,000 people applied. What were the odds? But, at least I had given it a try. So then I moved on to another location for remote research, which was American Samoa, a small Pacific island that had a NOAA base that studied the climate. So I started working there, and there I was able to kind of gain some more leadership experience, which is also a very important sort of step along your career path. I was named station chief, so I was sort of in charge of the whole deal there. And again, I had the things that I loved. I had still my hobbies in the night sky. And I found out that my love of the ocean sort of took a little bit of a tropical flair. I gave up the sailing and started doing outrigger canoeing, Hawaiian South Pacific style canoeing, which was awesome. And while I was in Samoa, I got some news. I found out I had been invited to do interviews at NASA for the job. And this entailed 2 week-long interviews where I flew from American Samoa to Houston, Texas, and this island was so small that there were only 2 flights per week that left the island. And I was pretty sure I was the only person who hadn't worn anything other than flip-flops in 6 weeks out of all the other candidates. So it was a pretty intimidating process. We went through a lot of tests. We had a lot of different types of things that we were put through. Medical tests, physical challenges, mental challenges, teamwork challenges, not to mention the actual interview process itself. So it was really interesting because during my interview, they kind of could care less about the electrical engineering experience and successes that I had had, but they were really into talking about rock climbing in Antarctica and the tools that I had used to get through those times to be adaptable, the operational experience I had had when I worked on military aircraft with the cryogenics. So finally I felt like this really unconventional path I had taken had actually led me to be able to express the same experience that the interview committee was interested in hearing about. But as you can imagine, I kind of thought that was still the closest I would ever get to NASA for real. And, oops, wow. That was a huge spoiler alert. I went back to my job in Samoa thinking I would never get a call from NASA. And I continued with the cultural experiences that I loved with my job. I continued with the outreach there. And then one day at 6:15 in the morning, my phone rings. And on the line is a lady who says she's from Houston, and I said, "Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity to interview. I had a great time. I appreciate it." She said, "No, I'm calling to tell you we want to invite you to Houston. We want you to join our team of astronauts." And I was speechless. She said, "Hello?" And I said, "I'm here." It's about all I could figure out to say, but eventually we did make it to discussing what she had called for, which was to plan the fact that I had been accepted into the astronaut corps. And interestingly, it actually took me about an hour before I started crying and realizing what had happened. And in fact, they asked us to not talk about the fact that we had been selected because they wanted to do a press release. So I didn't get to tell anyone that day what had happened that morning. And by the time I got back from work, I thought, was that a dream? Luckily, I had scribbled down some notes on a Post-it pad, so I went back. The first thing I did when I got back from work was find those notes, and sure enough, it had happened. And sure enough, this happened a couple months later. So we had a big press release to announce the new astronaut class, and there I was on the stage. 7 other people that basically had pinched themselves that morning and every morning since they had gotten the phone call as well. But we were about to embark on a really exciting journey together. And you might wonder, how do you take 7 people that are kind of deer in headlights about this new job that they had and turn them into astronauts? Well, the first thing you do is you put them on a plane and make the plane fall out of the sky so that they learn what it's like to be in zero G. Like, okay, feeling a little more real. Yeah, I got a blue costume on and I'm floating. So that was kind of the first, one of the first things that we got to do as a group. And then they stuck us in the woods for a week and we had survival training. So we learned how to make fire, how to make shelter, and how to survive in the woods. But most importantly, we learned how to work together, and we bonded as a team, and we learned how to behave as a team. From there, we started the first of our real training flows, which for the 3 of us of the 8 that didn't have any aviation experience meant going to a real Navy flight school. And we had a 2-month program at this flight school, and the first thing we had to do was to pass a really difficult swim test where we had to do laps in a pool, tread water, and then do this dead man's float for way longer than I ever thought I could do it in full flight gear. So that was the first challenge, and I'm actually happy. I still think this was the hardest thing I ever did in my astronaut training, and I'm really glad it came first, because I figured out that for someone, believe it or not, I had never actually swam laps. I could swim, but I didn't know any real swimming strokes. So I came into it with that level of experience, having to pass this test, and getting through that was a huge deal for me. And so we went on to the academic part of learning how to fly airplanes, and the plane we were learning to fly was a T6 turboprop plane. And so I set up a little cockpit of the plane in my kitchenette in my hotel room and practiced what we call in flight school chair flying, which is you run through an entire fake flight, including everything you're going to say to air traffic controllers, all the inputs you're going to do on your fake little screens. And you guys might know this. You know how moms are so sweet and helpful, and they want to do everything they can to be a part of your life and help you. So my mom had said, "Is there anything I can do? You're so busy." I said, "You know what? Yeah, there is. I'm going to email you." I just taught her how to use email. I'm going to email you this script. Could you pretend to be air traffic controller on the other line, on the end of the phone, and I'll say my lines and you say yours. And it was really cute because, bless her heart, she's talking just like a mom. She's like, "Well, text the 981, you are cleared for takeoff." And unfortunately, the real air traffic controllers weren't quite that nice, but I did get through the flow and eventually was able to fly those planes on a regular basis and get through our syllabus at Navy Flight School. So I'm feeling pretty good, I'm about it now. And then I go back to NASA, where instead of turboprop planes, we're learning how to fly supersonic jets. And there's a little bit of a difference when you're going twice as fast and you're covering 4 miles every minute. But it's one of those things where everything you do seems difficult. So I had these moments all the time where my instructor pilots would be like ready to go and I'd still be forgetting my knee board and all my stuff. But those intimidation moments, again, are just reasons to muster your best self, do your best, and get through it, and trust in yourself, have the confidence that you need to get through those times. And eventually I found myself here. So this is me on a formation flight in the NASA T-38 jet. Normally don't have time for selfies in the jet, but on formation flights, you actually share duties between the 2 people in the back seat. So in this case, the backseater of the other jet was doing all the work, all the communication, navigation, handling, things that came up, and all I had to do was basically sit back, learn, and watch. So why do we fly in supersonic jets? It's because NASA has recognized the need for what they call spaceflight readiness training. And this is the training that I think is most important to take a brain of an engineer that is used to solving problems, sitting in a nice quiet office with, my favorite playlist on, just comfortable as can be for hours if needed, solving one complex problem, and having to be in a jet with an oxygen mask on, a tiny little scratch pad, solving multiple problems at a time while communicating and punching buttons on your displays. So luckily it was really effective in that way, and I have another demonstration of a formation flight and how it can get a little bit hairy and the things that we are trained to take on if they should occur. So when you're flying with another aircraft off of your wing only a few feet away, the last thing you want to hit is cloud layers. And it does happen sometimes, and we have procedures to handle that when it should occur, but that's just one example of spaceflight readiness training and why we fly supersonic jets on a regular basis. And this is something that I learned how to do in my candidate training, but we all continue to fly every week to maintain our skills. Okay, then we move into the next training flow, which is space station systems. So now an engineer is very happy. I have schematics to look at. I'm finally not out of my element. And we had to learn about every system on the space station: life support system, data commanding systems, thermal systems, electrical power generation systems, communication systems, driving the station systems, and how they're all interconnected, how to deal with them when they break, and how to work with ground crews on those systems. So this is us inside the mock-up that we have at Johnson Space Center of the International Space Station, learning how to do some, in this case, I think we were learning how to jumper different systems of the cooling loops when we may have a leak and we have to actually eliminate the source of a leak. So we learn a little bit of everything. We also get to learn how to exercise in space. So without gravity, how do you go running? Well, you actually have to strap on a harness to pull you down onto the treadmill. So there's actually an astronaut that ran an entire marathon in space, which I will not be doing. But it's interesting for those of you that may be interested in these types of things. You may have heard that in the past, when astronauts came back from long-duration missions, they experienced muscle and bone atrophy. Well, NASA has actually figured out effective ways to mitigate that, and how they've done it is, one, by the treadmill exercise, but more importantly, by figuring out the specific thing about lifting weight and resisting weight that we all have just on a normal day on Earth, and the specific thing about that that's needed in microgravity to cause our bones and muscles to not have that response to atrophy. And it turns out that it's actually the compression event. So you can't get it with just band exercises and resistance exercises. You actually have to simulate the ends of the motion, where the motion comes to a stop and imparts a little bit of force on the musculoskeletal system. So they have a very complex weightlifting system, cooler than Bowflex or Soloflex, and that's a requirement in our days on station, is to actually exercise for 2 hours every day. So we got a little practice. And we got to learn the most important thing: how to work on the space toilet. Because on the space station, you actually drink your recycled urine. And they say that it's cleaner than regular tap water on Earth, but I definitely don't want it to be into the situation of not knowing how to fix those systems should they break. So Space Plumbers Union was born. Now, all the while learning these space station systems and learning how to fly, we had another thing going on in the background, which was learning the Russian language. And Again, for an engineer, this isn't always easy. And I remember, my first week even of Russian, we're learning the alphabet, real basic stuff. Hi, how are you? And they teach me how to say, "Я очень устала и очень занята," which means I am very tired and busy. So apparently that was a very important phrase for us to learn in astronaut candidate school. And it was, I used it quite a bit. And then our next and final training flow, the kind of final big training flow, was learning how to do spacewalks. So for me and for the other folks that I came into the class with, this was kind of an exciting day, the day you get to try on your spacesuit costume. So we started with a suit fit, but there was some stuff we had to learn before we actually before we were able to actually get into the suit and do our work, train to do our work. And the first of those is to learn what it's like to move something that has a lot of mass but no weight. So it turns out that even though we're in microgravity, it's still difficult to maneuver these really large pieces of equipment that we may have to repair and replace on the external side of station during spacewalks. So for example, these things are often 500 pounds or would be 500 pounds on Earth. And we go into a virtual reality lab and actually learn how we might maneuver these things, how you brace yourself so that you can maneuver these things. And obviously, it was a fun day, cooler than a video game for sure. We also had to learn how to use the space drill, because it turns out that in microgravity, if you aren't bracing yourself properly, when you try to use a drill, it will actually spin you. And that can be a problem. So we learned the proper technique on the space drill to not let that happen. And finally, we get cleared to actually start the real training. So our spacewalk training is done in a gigantic pool. It's 40 foot deep, 100 feet long, 200 feet wide. And there's an entire mock-up of the International Space Station in this pool. And we do a simulated 6-hour run in our spacesuits in the pool, which I'll show in a second. But first, we have to get on our astronaut long johns, which is a liquid cooling garment that has a bunch of tubes embedded throughout it to enable us to stay cooled while we're in this our own personal spacecraft known as the spacesuit. And this is me at work in the pool. So even though they make every attempt to make the spacesuit neutrally buoyant in the water, it still isn't perfect, and every motion you make is difficult. One, because the neutral buoyancy isn't perfect, and two, because it's pressurized. So you're actually working against a pressurized suit with the limited mobility that is just inherent in the suit design, and it is extremely physically challenging, as well as requires a ton of focus because you're doing hard things all the while in a lot of physical pain. Well, I wouldn't say physical pain, but it's an endurance match for sure. They've done the metabolic studies on it and found it's the metabolic equivalent of running a marathon. All the while, you can't scratch your own nose or eat anything. So these are very difficult training missions for us. And getting through this training flow was definitely, next to the swim test, the hardest thing that I've done so far in my life. But we were successful, and this is me and my colleague Victor at the end of our run. We had several runs in our training flow, but as you can see, in the suit, there's a lot of different sizes. It is true that the suit was designed for a much larger individual than myself, but even though some people have commented that I look like a little Victor's doll in this, it turns out that with a lot of physical training and preparation, it's definitely possible to be successful in this suit. A couple other little follow-up trainings that we had to learn how to work the space station robotic arm, which is used to actually grapple the cargo vehicles that come to space station, as well as to hold an astronaut during a spacewalk. So we had to learn how to manipulate that. And we also had to learn the science aboard, because the space station is actually a laboratory. It's not just a national laboratory, but a worldwide laboratory where cutting-edge research is being conducted in an environment that's just not possible on Earth. So one of the main sort of interesting physical sciences that's being studied on station is in material science, and that's obviously a big field here at State. And the cool thing is that when you're in microgravity, you don't always have these pesky, what I think of as edge conditions when you're modeling fluid properties and things like that. Because on Earth, gravity actually can interfere with our empirical studies of fundamental fluid properties and things like that. So space offers that's just one small example of the microgravity research that's going on. There's biological research, research that has genetic implications, research that has implications for future long duration space travel, like going to Mars and things like that. There's astronomy and astrophysics research going on board, and many, many, many other types, plant physiology tests and other research. So it's a fantastic laboratory, and that is really the main purpose of it being there in terms of tangible outputs. I personally think that there are a lot of intangible reasons that it's a good thing to have NASA as a space program representing the entire world that we can talk about later if you would all like. So after all that training, we were finally graduated astronauts. All that was squeezed into 2 years, and that's all I got. I mean, it was amazing. So this is my final video for the day, and I put it up here because, I think it's always important to have a guiding principle. And for me, one of those was remembering the reasons that I got into my love for the space and for NASA. At first it was just the whim of a kid who wanted to be an astronaut. And then it was the whim of someone who had learned a little bit more about it and recognized how much good I really thought NASA was doing for the world. And then the final stage was, it was the whim of someone who recognized the goodness that NASA's doing and also felt actually ready and able to contribute to that work. So throughout that process, though, there's stumbling blocks. There's times that you feel, one, maybe your mind changed. Maybe you don't want to do this after all. Maybe it's too hard. Maybe you just want to fall back into something easy that isn't truly relying on your passions. And so I think it's important to have a driving light, to have something that reminds you why you love something in the beginning. And for me, I actually found that in the night sky, and particularly in aurora. And knowing that I might one day have the opportunity to see auroras from above and to share that through my eyes with the rest of the world was something that kept me going during a lot of times when I thought for sure I could not do this. So we have a video. Oh, we don't. Wait, actually, yeah. It played earlier. No. It's a really cool video, so if we can see it, I'd like to, but if it, I don't know, it's weird. It played before. Well, imagine a really awesome video of, and maybe we can get someone to get that phone out and Google awesome auroras from station, and actually you can find some on YouTube, so we won't cry about that. But I think the important part I want to drive home is that having something as a guiding light is very important, because it's not always going to be easy, and you're going to get disillusioned, and it's important to remember what drives you and what originally drove you and what actually were the foundations of that life that you imagine for yourself that's so important to attain. Before we end, I have a couple more quick slides, so you can forward. Oh wait, that's me, that's right. Okay, so because not everyone wants to go to Antarctica and freeze their toes off or even go into space, I wanted to talk about some awesome, inspiring people that I have met along the way. In the upper left is my friend Michelle, who is a marine biologist who grew up in landlocked Ohio, but I met her in American Samoa, and she was running a marine sanctuary down there, as well as getting to do awesome outreach with students. In the upper right is my friend Alex, who studied environmental engineering and biology, and then has since started an organic farm in Texas. Down in the bottom right is Mikkel, who I met at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, and she's a chemist. She has a PhD in chemistry, and she actually uses her skills to design instruments that can detect chemical and biological elements during times of war. So she actually works for the common good in the Department of Defense in that way. And then finally, my friend Jen, who gets to hug penguins every day for her job, first fell in love with wildlife biology when she was a girl, and she was fascinated by wolves. And she actually carried that throughout her career, and now she's a penguin wildlife biologist. In addition, there are a lot of different paths to becoming an astronaut. These are some members of my astronaut class. There are 8 of us. In the upper left is my friend Drew. He is a medical doctor in the Army, but he is also a certified badass. He jumps out of planes and does deep diving, a lot like a Special Forces in the Army. He is in the Special Forces of the Army, but much like the Navy SEALs, so he's done some amazing work. But he is a medical doctor with also an engineering background. In the lower left is Jessica Meir, who is a animal physiologist. She studies animals that do amazing things like geese that can fly over the Himalayas and penguins and seals that can deep dive. And she is the only other civilian in the class of astronauts. She and I are the 2 scientists or engineers that came in, and the other 6 in the class actually have a military background. And as I mentioned, 4 of them have an aviation background. So that brings me to Anne McLean in the top right. She is an Army helicopter test pilot. And Nick, who is a flight engineer in the Air Force. So he wasn't a pilot himself, but he learned aviation, and he flew and operated instruments in aircraft, and then became involved in the space program of the Air Force. Just a little note about NASA's future plans. So as you all may know, NASA is planning a mission to Mars, but it's not planned until the mid-2030s. So in the meantime, we're gonna be getting a new spacecraft called the Orion spacecraft, which is designed to leave low Earth orbit, and some of its first missions are gonna be to fly around the moon and back. We don't have any plans to land on the moon at this time, but we're gonna use the area around the moon, which is called cislunar space, to develop some of the technologies that are gonna be needed for this Mars mission. And one of the really neat missions that they're talking about is called an asteroid redirect mission, where we actually bring a small asteroid and put it in that region of space and send astronauts to explore that asteroid. So in that way, we're gonna be developing awesome new technologies to work in deep space in new ways that we've never done before, and testing some of that technology pretty close to home. And that is actually slated to have its first crewed mission in 2021, and its first test mission in about 2017, 2018. It has already had one test mission that you may have heard about, which was called EFT-1, Exploration Flight 1, where the Orion capsule was launched and did an orbit around the Earth, and then had a nominal landing in the ocean, and was the capsule was recovered by the Navy. So it's an exciting time to be with NASA. You may have heard of SpaceX. SpaceX and Boeing are both commercial crew partners of NASA, and they're going to be actually sending astronauts to the space station on their own designed spacecraft starting in 2017 and 2018. So it's a very exciting time. There's lots of missions on the horizon. And it's also an exciting time to be a part of the NASA in other ways than just engineering or becoming an astronaut. NASA is a community in and of itself, so we use business folks, lawyers, people interested in international partnership. There's a place for everyone who might find this type of work exciting. That's all I have. I would like to leave you with live the life you imagine for yourself, and take any questions. Thank you all. I saw a couple hands. Yes.
Out of all the things you went through, all this experience you have, what do you think was the most challenging one you faced?
The question was, out of everything I've done, what was the most challenging? And I would say the most challenging is actually overcoming your own internal challenges. Learning to trust yourself, to have the confidence to overcome things, and learning the mental fortitude required to go through basically whatever life can throw at you. So I would say that same challenge applied to many situations that I've been in has been the most important one to overcome, and that's why I say take on your fears, because that's the main way that you can learn to have that mental fortitude. Thank you. Of all the cold weather places I visited, which was my favorite? I would have to say my favorite was the first because it was the one that had the most impact on me because, one, I was there the longest, and also it was the first time I had undergone any of these experiences. So the first time you stand on the Antarctic ice sheet is probably going to be one of the most profound experiences of your life, and it's going to stick with you forever. So I would say the South Pole because of its uniqueness, both geographically, the idea that you were somewhere that you couldn't deny being on a planet, not just a place, but a planet because of the astronomical things going on around you, the fact that you didn't see the sun for 6 months, the fact that the sun went like this in the sky and not up and down. So it was a special place. Yes?
So now that you've achieved your childhood dream, do you have a new dream?
I got asked that at the museum too, and I do. I have a lot of dreams, and it is an interesting place to be in your life where something you've thought about since as long as you can remember is achieved for two reasons. One, it's not always what you expect, so you have to adjust that dream in real time. And two, because you have to remember there's going to be a life after it as well. You know, it's interesting, you hear studies about NFL players that actually really struggle when their season, when their, career, their first career is over. And so, it's kind of similar. I think that you all might experience that when you finally graduate and start your first job. It's going to be a really different environment where you aren't evaluated and getting the same feedback that you're used to getting. And so having to rekey and still have something on your horizon to look forward to is important. But since I'm not a politician, and I will answer your question actually, I will say that my next goal, because I did just get married last year, would be to focus on having a very happy marriage, and having our next adventure be something that we both are fully into and love and can contribute together to. We don't know what that is yet. Yes.
So what's your next plan with NASA? When do you know if you'd be going to space or not?
So right now, after we graduated, we all got a ground job. So my life right now is broken up into about quarter-time chunks. Quarter of the time, I'm flying the jet and doing continuous training like Russian and working out every day. A quarter of the time, I'm doing things like this and getting to do outreach and spread the awesome work that NASA's doing. About a quarter of the time, I do my day job, which we all were assigned to a different aspect of the human spaceflight program within the crew office. So as astronauts, because of our training experiences, we do a lot of liaising with different departments and sort of being the crew presence in a lot of conversations, both design work, developing policies and protocols and whatnot. And some people are working on future vehicles, some people are working on doing a job in mission control called CAPCOM, which is the capsule communicator, which is the person that talks up and down, the person that you say, Houston, we have a problem too. And so I am training to do that. So the other quarter time of my training is continuing on in what they call pre-assignment training, which is things like learning how to CAPCOM, learning how to do field maintenance training, and other trainings that they've identified that are important to do before we get a mission assignment, but that weren't needed in those first 2 years of astronaut candidate. In terms of when I might know when I fly, that is not known. What we were told during our first interview is that it could be up to 10 years from that day. So that day was about 4 years ago. So I think my class, there's about 10 rookies in the office right now out of a total of 50 active astronauts. So those 10 of us have not had a flight assignment yet. But as they come a few times a year. And then as these new flight opportunities come online with the new spacecraft, they could come more often. So I think most of us would hope to hear about a mission assignment within maybe 4 years or so, and then it's about 1.5 to 2 years of training for your mission. Yes?
Is there any experience or particular experiment you're looking forward to doing in space?
The question was, is there any experience or experiment that I'm looking forward to doing in space? And because I would imagine that the space station is a likely place that my first mission may be, I'm definitely looking forward to contributing to the science on the space station. Having worked in the Antarctic, that was one of the main things I did, was the eyes and ears, the fix-it person, the person who implemented and calibrated instruments. And I love being involved in science, but getting to kind of get my hands dirty and really work on stuff. So I'm really just looking forward to carrying out research for folks that are on the ground on the International Space Station. I would absolutely love a Mars mission assignment down the road if I were so lucky to be chosen for one. So there's really a wide variety, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing those auroras. Yes?
What do you think the most valuable college experience was?
The most valuable college experience I had. I would say during my time here, one of the things I actually did the most of outside of my studies was community service. And I was involved in a lot of different campus clubs, Engineers Without Borders, BGLA, the Society of Women Engineers. I did all kinds of things that spoke to my drive for social equality and spreading the word and to a diverse audience. So I would say my experience doing that was very, very important, and it led me to always look for ways that I could be a contributor rather than someone who took away from a situation. And when you look at situations as how can I best contribute, it often brings to the forefront your best self. And so I would say seeking out opportunities like that, and the fact that NC State has so many of those opportunities was really important.
We have time for about one more question.
And one easy question. Oh, is there a hand? Someone's pointing, but I don't see the hand, so yes, please.
Right there.
Oh, yes, I see it now. Thank you.
What is your opinion on like SpaceX and the private space industry?
Sure. The question was about my opinion on SpaceX and the private space industry. And as a whole, NASA is wholeheartedly excited about the commercial space aspect of the work that we're doing. The cool thing that NASA, I think, the way they're doing it, which I think is so smart, is they're fostering that commercial ability by giving the contracts to companies to do the things that we've done before. We know how to bring astronauts to and from low Earth orbit. We've done that before. So let's foster that within the private sector while we focus our efforts on the next step, on leaving low Earth orbit, on these deep space missions. So we are wholeheartedly excited about Boeing and SpaceX being our partners. We have visited those facilities. That was part of our astronaut training, was to form relationships with those folks and to learn more about what they're doing. So we're very excited. And I think it's exciting because it has so many ripple effects throughout the economy. It's not just something that is applied just to getting astronauts to and from the space station, but it also encompasses, for example, having great rockets to launch commercial satellites on, which, for example, SpaceX, when they had that awesome success at re-landing the first stage, that wasn't even a NASA-sponsored mission. That was GPS satellites or something like that. So it really fosters a strong abilities within our own private sector, which is good for the American economy, it's good for Department of Defense and all that. And I guess that's our last question. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Hello, my name is Rahul Kathard. Thank you, Astronaut Cook. We've been working on this since the Astronaut Class was first announced in 2013. And you can imagine our disappointment in learning we had to wait till you finished your training to come speak. And our anxiety at learning, hoping this would happen, and how delighted we were to learn it finally would. Astronaut Cook exemplifies the success that comes from pursuing your passion, both inwardly and outwardly, through many different activities and experiences. Just once again, thank you very much for speaking.